Hey friends, welcome back to another Before You Read lecture. This is the first of two Before You Read lectures on Paul's letter to the Romans. So this will cover Romans 1 through 8, as well as some broader general orientation information about the letter to the Romans. Briefly, in terms of an orientation to Romans, most New Testament scholars think that Romans was written near the end of Paul's Aegean ministry, so somewhere around 58 CE, and that Paul is writing from Corinth. He mentions or gives details of this in Romans 16:23. As you can see, it's written towards the end of his life, maybe not as late as Philippians or 2 Timothy, but it is some 20 years or so after his transformative encounter with the risen Christ. It is directed to a community or a set of communities that Paul did not found and that Paul did not visit, has not visited yet. And we see in Romans 14 through 15 especially, but elsewhere, there seems to have been a conflict among Jews and Christians who were associating with one another in these Roman congregations. This might connect with an event that happened on the ground in Rome in around that time period. We know that from Suetonius and his Life of Caesar, that the Emperor Claudius expelled Jews from Rome because of an apparent controversy related to a figure known as Chrestus. And scholars have suggested that this Chrestus is actually just a misspelling of Christ or Messiah, and that there might have been an earlier conflict between Christ-believing Jews and non-Christ-believing Jews that led Claudius to say, if you're Jewish, you gotta leave Rome. We're not gonna have you here. And so it seems, though, that after Claudius died, Jews began to return to Rome. And according to Acts 18, Priscilla and Aquila, who are mentioned in Acts and also in 1 Corinthians, are among those who make their way back. And Priscilla and Aquila are also named in Romans 16. So all that is maybe some texture to the historical context of Romans, that it's a community that has ethnically Jewish folks, Gentile folks, who are trying to do life together in the way of Christ. Like Paul's other letters, this one follows a traditional letter format with a salutation in 1 through 7, word of thanksgiving in 1:8 through 15, and then the body of the letter from 1:16 all the way through 15:21. There are some closing words and greetings in 15:22 through 16:24, and then a doxology at the end in 16:25 through 27. It says in Romans 16:22 that a figure named Tertius is the one who actually wrote Romans. So this is one of those places where it seems more likely than not that Paul actually dictated his letter and that Tertius was the writer of Romans. It's also very likely that Phoebe, who is mentioned in 16:1, is the person responsible for bringing the letter from Paul to the Romans, but also Phoebe may very well have been the very first reader of Romans, the first interpreter of Romans, and she may have been present with Paul in the process of its writing. Very significant figure. Romans expresses two practical concerns on the part of Paul. The first is that he desires to visit Spain and sees his visiting Rome as a jumping off point to that journey to Spain. Spain for Paul was the end of the world as he knew it. That was as far as it went. And so this is part of his desire to preach the good news through all of the inhabited world. The second practical concern in Romans is that of the collection for the poor Christians in Jerusalem. We see this in 15:25 through 29. And he wants the Christians in Rome to participate in that collection. Another sort of orienting feature of Romans is that of the argument. The first thing that will become obvious in comparison to some of Paul's other letters is just how much more argumentative it is. That not that he's fighting with people, but that it is an argument from beginning to end. A robust and sometimes complex theological argument about God and God's character and the nature of God's saving purposes. And one of the things that scholars have noted is the degree to which Romans resembles a style of argumentation from antiquity known as diatribe. Diatribe was popular among Cynic and Stoic philosophers at the time, and it really originated in the classroom. It was a way of testing for understanding and exploring the implications of an argument or a lesson. In diatribe, there typically was the form of argument typically included a thesis statement, then a statement of the antithesis, an antithesis, the opposite or the counter to it, then a restatement of the thesis, then an example, then an exposition, and then dealing with any objections. Now, some of those will be easier for us to identify in Romans than others, and there's no reason to think that Paul would have slavishly followed that form of argument. But for me, the really important thing is to pay attention to the questions. Because what Paul does with his rhetorical questions is he sort of puts on the hat of an interested conversation partner who would say, wait, Paul, if I understand you correctly, what you're saying is fill in the blank. And then that causes Paul to clarify or explore the implications of something that he has just said. So the questions are one of the major sort of features of Romans that aligns it with the diatribe, and I think that can make it helpful for us reading Romans together. As I said, Romans is a large argument. And so as we begin our study of Romans, I thought I would give you a brief outline of the argument. And so we see the thesis statement in Romans 1:16 through 17, and I'll talk more about that in a second. Then Romans 1:18 through 3:20 is really the antithesis to the thesis statement. If the thesis statement says something about God's revivifying power and the ability to make things alive, then the antithesis of that is all about death. It's about unrighteousness. It's about faithlessness. And so 1:18 through 3:20 are really the mirror image of 1:16 through 17. Then in Romans 3:21 through 31, we get the restatement of the thesis. Again, following along in many ways with that structure of the argument. In Romans 4, we have an example. The example that Paul provides is Abraham. Abraham, this figure of faith, this figure in Israel's sacred tradition, becomes for Paul an example that proves his thesis about God, about God's saving purposes, and about what it means for humanity to be righteous and to be alive. Then in 5:1 through 8:39, this is essentially the explication, the explanation, or the exposition of Paul's thesis statement. And so Paul will talk widely about things like righteousness and about new life and about death and about the Spirit and all of these things. But really, this is the exposition of his thesis statement. We might think about Romans 9 through 11 as a major objection to Paul's argument, and it really is an important piece in the argument. Paul basically opens in 9:1 with the question, have the promises of God failed? And the subtext here is, has God abandoned Israel? Has God abandoned his historical people of Israel? And Paul wants to say a resounding no to that, but that objection is also bound up with God's character, as it has been the whole argument up to this point. Then in 12:1 through 15:13, we might think about this as an application of the argument. It sort of is it follows from everything else that Paul has argued. And this is the new life as God's people, what it means to organize our lives together according to this story, according to this thesis about God. And then 15, 14 through the end is the closing. So again, the meat of the argument really resembles that diatribe style in significant ways. I want to zero in just a little bit on this thesis statement, because I think understanding the thesis statement is really important for engaging the rest of Romans. And so the thesis statement, that's what I'm describing it as, is Romans 1:16 through 17, which reads, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God for salvation to everyone who has faith, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed through faith for faith. As it is written, the one who is righteous will live by faith." There's a lot that could be said about this, and a lot that has been said about it, but I want to tease out just a couple of things. The first is the importance of this quotation from Habakkuk 2:4, "The one who is righteous will live from faith," or from faithfulness. It seems to suggest that faithfulness, turning to God, trusting in God, being reliable in the eyes of God, is that which leads to life. So there's this vital connection between life and righteousness, and on the other hand, death and unrighteousness. So that unrighteousness, according to the thesis statement, would be sort of the absence of faith and the absence of life, and of course, the absence of righteousness. And so that thesis statement, that the language of absence that I just talked about, is really what we see in 1:18 through 3:20. Paul elaborates on that. So the thesis statement tells us that the way in which God's salvation works is it works for all of those who have faith, for all of those who put their trust in God, for all of those who align themselves maybe with the ways of God. Paul says it's to the Jew and to the Greek. There's no discrepancy, and Paul will talk about this again elsewhere. And that ultimately there is this connection between righteousness and life and faith. These three things are all in an orbit together. So that's the thesis statement. And I've already mentioned the ways in which that thesis statement will shape the argument in 1:18 through 3:20. Then later in 3:21 and following, Paul will restate this thesis statement. And then in 4:1, what I want you to pay attention to in 4:1 is the example of Abraham. Pay attention to the role of life in the story of Abraham. And this is some of Paul's creative reading of Genesis. Pay attention to what Paul says about the connection between faith and righteousness and life as it relates to Abraham. And then 5 through 8, chapters 5 through 8 will really explore those connections a little bit more and take them in some different directions and introduce things like being life in the Spirit in chapter 8. But that should be enough to get you started. In terms of a reading strategy, in terms of questions that you might consider, the first is I would encourage you to pay close attention to the rhetorical questions that Paul asks. In many ways, these mark a shift in his argument as he's dealing with his prospective student who is asking about the implications or possible confusion of his argument. So pay attention to the questions. The second is pay attention to this connection between life and righteousness and faith. Where do you see it? How do you see those things working together? And then the final thing is, oftentimes Romans is treated as a sort of roadmap to individual or personal salvation. And what I would encourage you to do is, especially with chapters 5 through 8, keep an eye on when God's saving purposes are actually cosmic in scope. That God's saving purposes are not just about plucking out individuals from hell or something like that, but that God's saving purposes have the entire cosmos, the entire created world, all that we can conceive of as being directed, or seeing God's saving purposes directed towards the whole cosmos. All right, that's all I want to say for now about Romans 1 through 8. More to come next week with Romans 9 through 16. But thank you so much for your time, and happy reading.